I'm Nicole.
And I'm Emma.
And you're listening to Mixed Up.
Obviously, the main characters of Clare and Irene, they're both really operating on choice as to, who they are or how they live their lives. And we kind of wanted to start there with you. What do you think? Do you think that passing truly is a choice in the context of the characters and just in general?
Well, I think one of the things that both our film and certainly Nella Larsen's work in this novella is exploring is this central question of how free are we actually as humans to choose? Like how much freedom do we have in construction of identity? And then if you add any particulars, the particulars of race, of gender, of sexual orientation, then the space with which you are free to create identity and move through space as the most authentic version of yourself gets even smaller. And I think that's something that sort of Nella is speaking to in this. One thing that I love so much about the book and in seeing the film for the first time when we screened more recently in New York was it sort of does a hat trick. It presents from the very beginning as a narrative around passing. You see Irene the only time you see her pass, right? Through this sort of hat.
Yeah.
And then you see her the rest of the film passing in arguably more ways than Claire's character. And I think that's really fascinating. But I'm curious for you, Ruth, like how in creating Claire, did it feel like this is actively a choice that she is making? Is it her choice?
Yeah, that's something that I thought about and ruminated about a lot because, there's not that much narrative out there about passing because it's such a, it was such a secretive act, shrouded in secrecy as it needed to be. I think, your root family was sort of conspiratorial with you because you needed to be protected. And the world that you were moving into, the white world, couldn't know. And so it's still, it's still kind of a taboo subject, really. And I think there are families who have no idea that someone passed in their amongst their ancestors. I mean, definitely there is. For me, I don't know. I think it's so complicated because I think passing was an avenue to opportunity. In a world where people of color's access to opportunity was so limited by the social mores of the time, by laws. Jim Crow was very, very alive and thriving, and would become more entrenched as time went on. And so this passing provided an opportunity for people to have the opportunity to reach their potential, which they might not have had, probably not have had, if they had stayed within their community and be seen as a Black of color.
Yes.
And I think that, but in order to do that, you have to shed a very important part of your identity. You have to become entirely, for many people, most people, disconnected from your family. You have to almost wipe out your past, everything. And I don't know, the cost of that psychologically is very present in Nella's novel book. And also you're also carrying this secret that because your life depends on it, this isn't just isn't a frivolous choice because you want to be able to shop, necessarily. It's a choice because you want a better life. And it's a very dangerous choice. And I don't think that's emphasized as much as it should be. And for Claire, I think, we meet her. She's been orphaned. She's living with her white aunts, who you can imagine at that time how difficult that must have been. And for her, someone who was so alive and so full of desire and unashamed about that desire, the only way she could access that was to pass. And you're meeting her at a point in your life when the benefits for her are receding,
Right.
you know, and the cost is very much
weighty,
becoming very apparent for her.
I think it was interesting what you said, because, and we'll come on to this later, but we talked about the two phrases that kind of encapsulated the movie for us. And for me, it was, I'm not safe. And I think, you know, as you say, the idea of passing isn't something that is really that widely understood or known from a historical perspective.
Exactly.
And I think to pick up on what you were saying, it's also very much changed into the modern day as to how we understand that phrase now, and the connotations around it. We'll circle back to that, but I just wanted to actually take it back a step and ask you both, you know, as mixed women, there must have, well, I would assume there's an extra resonance when you were approached to do this film, and kind of a personal element to it. How, you know, what did you feel when you were approached to do the film? Like, what did you think about it?
I think one interesting thing in particular about Irene is she is a woman who has not necessarily contended with her own privilege, I think. And that is something that I found really interesting. And also just, you know, I still think it's very rarefied to have the opportunity as a Black female performer to do something that is really about the interiority of a character. There are so many, if you look at Hollywood iconography, even you look at the slate of films this year, there are so many films that talk about the inner lives of white women, where you get to follow them in a very subjective experience, go through their daily lives, whether it's they're contending with the small things, motherhood or marriage. You get to watch white women in those spaces so much. And that is a privilege we've not been afforded. And also, I think not a lot of Black female performers are afforded the privilege of actually existing in narratives where there's ambiguity. So often we are tasked inside of narratives. We do a service. We play parts that are functional, that move story forward in service of other folks. And very rarely do we have the experience to exist just for our own sake, on our own terms. And that's something, and Ruth and I get to do that arguably more than many other Black women, because we have a layer of privilege inside of our mixed race identity and being light skinned, right? So I think that's something that I thought a lot about as I was playing a character that is unwilling to unpack her own privilege. I was allowing myself to continue to unpack my own. So it felt in that way like a very interesting, I guess, I don't know, meta experience. And then I also think something that's so fascinating for Irene, she presents and thinks of herself as this pillar, you know, inside of sort of the Black community, that she's very tethered in a way to her Blackness, but she is unwilling, for example, to discuss the race problem in her house. She's unwilling to have honest conversations with her husband and thereby her sons about what it is to be a Black American. And we all know, even now, we exist in bodies that are not safe. And her inability to really talk about that means that in some ways she is like not actually living inside of a true and honest Black experience. And that I thought was so interesting. You know, I really enjoy the opportunity, particularly in the context of period films, to unpack sort of how I'm showing up now. And I think we have this idea, it's easier, the less you know about history, it's easier to imagine you'd always be on the right side of it. And I think there are many Black Americans even that could pass. I mean, I'm not someone that could past now. But there are folks, you know, it's interesting to think about, like, what would you have done? You know, what would you have done if that was your experience? And I think it's a lot easier and frankly lazier to assume that you would have done the quote right thing. And so I really enjoyed the opportunity to play in that space and to be asking those questions of self. You know?
I think it's really interesting as well to think about Black motherhood and what you were describing in terms of being safe and safety. And I think that again is what, you know, perhaps I didn't realize that when I was thinking about it previously, but now that you're saying that idea of like you being safe, but as a mother keeping your children safe and what that means in Black motherhood.
Yeah.
Specifically at that time in history. I mean, of course, now.
And
but,
now, yeah.
Yeah, and now.
And passing certain lessons on, right?
I know. I mean, that's the thing that's so tragic, right, is that the course of progress, the hand of progress moves quite slowly. And you could pluck that conversation that I have with the brilliant Andre Holland as Brian. You could pluck that and put that in a modern Black parent's mouth last summer and in America, and that would have been relevant. It's interesting, that idea of safety too, that Claire says, I'm not safe, that Ruth says so brilliantly, I'm not safe. But arguably, I think in some ways she is safer because she at least knows that. Look, I'm gonna take care of me.
It's a question.
And Irene thinks that she's so safe, and meanwhile she's out here breaking china and, you know, is terribly unsafe because she has so many things, so many desires and impulses that are unchecked. So I think also just safety in terms of our own sort of mental space is such a murky thing, which is the brilliance, I think, of Nella's work and what we got to do.
Definitely. I was very worried about Irene the whole time. Like, I worried about her most.
Exactly. I think we, you know, when we watched this film, I immediately, to Emma, was like, I felt like I was watching a horror film. Like, I was so tense the entire time because I could just tell, you know, there was that feeling of, what's that word that you used? You were like, there's a feeling of like,
just unease. Just
yeah, exactly.
The whole time.
And it was done so perfectly. It was done so well.
Yeah.
But yeah, going off of what you were saying again about, you know, your, you know, privilege and being able to play certain characters that allow for, again, nuance, that allow for ambiguity and space. I think this film really resonated with us. Like I mentioned before, we really wanted to talk to you because it feels like a story, not only that's a human story, but obviously a story that's it felt like a story we could kind of relate to, again, as you know, as Black women, as mixed women. You know, there's so many elements to us that we feel like never get to be spoken about as openly. And, you know, again, duality and ambiguity. Did it feel special to you to be able to play? Is there a special kind of credence, again, to be able to play characters like this?
Yeah. I mean, in a nutshell. Well, the thing is, it's so rare is, and this is why, like, gosh, I'm so, I feel so indebted to Nella Larsen for writing these characters, you know, because, you know, especially with Claire, I feel like Nella was sort of this agitator, you know, this radical, because she's created a woman of color. I mean, she's passing, that actually is not, she's not the upstanding race woman. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Exactly.
There's no notion in the film she actually cares. You know, about being, you know, about elevating the race. You know, at that time there was the uplift, race women and race men, and it's quite obvious that she's self-interested, and that's really exciting because, you know, it sort of expands the sort of the box that women of color are often placed in. That you know, this kind of stoic, dignified,
strong,
strong Black woman, nurturer. That's so narrow, you know, and that sort of felt like that's all we were allotted. And this feels like a woman at that time rebelling against everybody, rebelling against every assignation that has been given her by others, you know. And I feel that must be it feels like her frustration at that time must have been immense. The idea that, you know, you kind of weren't allowed to create your own identity. As a Black woman, you're constantly by everybody, by Black men, Black white men, white women. Everybody else is sort of creating you and what you should be. And I feel this is Nella kind of stretching and out of that kind of those limitations, you know, to be able to construct her own identity, to be unashamed of her own capricious nature or a decision to be, you know, when you know, Claire says things like, you know, motherhood's not all it's cracked up to be. That's pretty radical.
Very, very radical.
Radical now.
I was going to say a conversation again that you could lift up. And
absolutely, they're everywhere. And you know, she admits to Irene, you know, I trample on everybody to get what I want. That's explicit. When you work on your desire, to me, that's revolutionary and super radical. And that's why, you know, Claire is the anti-heroine.
It also, doesn't it feel, we've talked about this, Ruth, before, how it kind of feels like it's Nella having an argument with herself about how to be.
It feels like an internal argument. Definitely. Absolutely. I picked up on that as well. It's definitely, you know, we talk about duality, we talk about push and pull, and, you know, between the two characters, you feel that the entire time.
Very
and it feels like it could be
super aware of that when we were actually doing it. You know, I think that consciously and unconsciously, these women are looking to the other to complete themselves.
Yes.
You know, you're attracted to people who sort of mirror you, but also have what you don't. And you think that being in their orbit, it might rub off on you, where you're kind of, you know, it might be like, you might kind of sort of, I don't know, by osmosis, kind of capture, you know, the qualities that you feel you lack. And so this kind of, it really felt like that helped with kind of like, we felt like they're magnets for each other.
And Rebecca also communicates that in film language. It's really exciting. Like, there are moments when I'll be in a shot and then Ruth will overtake that shot. You know, so there was also that sense of, you know, dancing it and trying to communicate it visually, and also with Zulina really trying to also talk about like colorism inside of a frame, you know, in ways that are just totally visual and not necessarily something that's spoken but exists on the page.
It's, you know, obviously there's so much jealousy between them, but that there's something that struck me as well. It was the kinship and the understanding that they could not get anywhere else in any of the other characters that they interacted with. And, you know, I feel like that's something that we've only discovered since we started the podcast and we created a community and met other mixed people that we needed so deeply. I wondered whether you related to that in real life.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we talked about this too, because it's so rarefied to get to play together. Typically, they would just be one of us.
Of course.
You know, and in Hollywood, especially, there has been such a lack of opportunity in space. You know, and so you're typically like, you don't have the chance to really get to be in conversation or in the same room. And Ruth and I had seen each other in passing, no pun intended. We'd like been out at parties together and like seen each other across a room and said like, hi. There was always like a sense of like, I bet we'd like each other if we had the opportunity to hang out. You know, there was always that, but it's like we didn't have the chance necessarily, you know? And so I think there's a lot of that just exists actually already dynamically, that is interesting to put on screen, and you get that sense in the book when you're reading it, that like these two characters, they like they're gonna set each other free and destroy each other.
Exactly.
Like there cannot, this idea that this, and it did. I'm so happy to hear you say it felt so fraught to me reading it. Felt Hitchcockian.
Yes.
It felt so exciting that Rebecca wanted to lens it that way, because I was like, this is a horror film. It is as tantalizing as delicious.
You can't look away.
This is like straight up genre for me. So I really appreciate that read first and foremost. Anyone that like misses that and doesn't see it as like Black girl Hitchcockian, like not interested in their read. Because I'm like,
exactly. Let's coin that, Black girl Hitchcockian.
I like it. Oh my god.
Yeah, so many people have said to me, like, I didn't realize I was holding my breath until the credits.
That's big. That's incredible.
So I just want to get a little bit deep for a moment. We've spoken on the podcast a lot about the notion or the label of passing before, and our listeners will know that it's something that we're quite passionate about, interrogating our feeling on the word being used, just because we feel like there's so much wrapped up in it that's so negative. Often when people talk about people who passed for white, they're thought of as devious. There's the idea that they're sly, willfully manipulative, and I guess I really
that's why it's so radical. And I think when you're marginalized and stereotyped, it's so difficult because you're aware of all the stereotypes that you have to avoid, the pitfalls you have to avoid. And that in itself is limiting, You can't explore the sides of yourself that do exist and maybe kind of do sort of blur the lines, regards to stereotypes.
Of course.
And that's why I think Nella constructed Claire like that, is that she, in a way, feels like Claire flirting with danger. There's a sort of thrill there, and this is obviously just my opinion, but I feel like it was Nella's sort of FU. Like, well, you think we're like this? Let's make her like this. It's for me, it's really subversive, and it's a railing against any sort of limitation, and that to me is what I think needs to continue to happen, because I feel like actors of people of color, marginalized people, disabled people, everyone is sort of has to be portrayed in a sort of a manner, and so we can't have real life, we can't have real life portrayed. We can't explore our anger. We can't explore our sort of sexual side, sensuality, because that's too close to the stereotype. And I think Nella understood that, and how dangerous any sort of limitation can be. And it's I think she understood, and I think she experienced limitations as an assault on her nature. And this, for me, is a sort of, I don't know, it's sort of like a manifesto in a way of like, look at us. We're your worst nightmare. We're here.
I love this.
We're kind of making a mockery of your Jim Crow because we've infiltrated you, and you don't even know. And that's, I think there's a pleasure there. That's why when her husband she's in the room with her husband and Irene, that kind of, it's almost as if he's not there, but they're watching each other respond.
It's manic almost, like the hysterical. I said to Nicole, I was like, the laughter that becomes a bit hysterical. They're laughing at him because he is the joke.
He doesn't get it.
Because he doesn't, he isn't in on it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I read that right, but that's what I was like, it must, like, you know, it became so manic that I was like, that must be it, because but it's so uncomfortable, and so, like, yeah, there's just a lot in that scene. It's incredible, honestly. Both of you, it just, the whole thing, yeah, it was breathtaking.
That laugh is my favorite. Something
That laugh
completely changes the temperature in that room.
Yeah.
And I think it's very layered, what that laugh is, and it's intentional in many ways, and I think it's very organic. But something happens to Claire, and I'm not sure if Tessa intended it, or Irene intended it, but something happens in that moment to each other when he manages to disarm Claire. No one disarms Claire.
Exactly.
It's such a incredibly dense and beautifully descriptive passage in the book that talks about the nature of that laugh. I mean, it's like, it's so juicy. It's so delicious. I've never worked on an adaptation before, and like Nella, it's so dense. So much happens in those 93 pages. There's so much going on, you know. It feels like, I've said this before, but it feels like playing like a piece of music that's just like stacked with notes and key changes and just like stuff, you know. It's like, but
it's I mean, it's interesting that you say that again, because even the music in the film again really speaks to that as well. And the film was musical, you know, like there's so much in that's, you know, all of the, like you said, you know, the technical and the film elements, the music, all of it. I mean, you know, we obviously read that the film was purposefully shot in black and white, which again is, you know, fits in so beautifully with, you know, the central concept and the themes, and, you know, there's no black and white, there's only shades of gray. And so it'd be good to talk a little bit more about, you know, why those decisions were made, and like if you could speak to those kinds of elements as well.
Yeah, it's exactly what you said in terms of, you know, the movie itself. Rebecca really wanted to create sort of this feeling that the movie itself is passing. It's presenting and performing its own place in sort of Hollywood history in a way. And exactly right. I mean, obviously there's sort of practical reasons why black and white is helpful. You sort of, in a movie that is about race, you sort of remove the color, but as you say, nothing is black and white. It's 1,000 shades of gray, right? And I think it felt very important to Rebecca that she be able, there is a rich history, Hollywood history of passing narratives, but where the character in question who is passing is played by a white actor. And she did not do that in this case, with the exception of the brilliant Freddie Washington. That's been the case in Hollywood for so long. And so she wanted to cast two women that are very unmistakably black women, so that your entry point as an audience member was someone who knew it was like being the family member to someone. You always know that you're looking at two black people passing, which creates this kind of tension and also absurdity when you have Alexander Skarsgård in the room. You're like, I know. Why is he not seeing what I'm seeing? Right? And for a piece that is about how race is its own construction, you know, Brian brilliantly says, like, what is race? If I knew that, I'd know a lot. It's unknowable. So all of those choices were really, you know, deliberate. And then the 4:3, the aspect ratio, before she even had language, she was just like, what's that thing that makes it feel kind of squished? And that aspect ratio. But, you know, and these were things that came to her 20 pages into reading the book. She just like was seeing it, you know, so intensely. And it's a testament to really her brilliance. And also, by the way, there were so many moments where she could have made concessions, or we could have made the movie, you know, arguably sooner and maybe for more money if she had made those concessions, whether it be like shooting it in color, or one of the most absurd things is they wanted her to write Alexander's character, the racist husband, if she had beefed up that part, a financier would have given her more money, which is like ludicrous and also speaks to,
oh my god,
oh gosh,
in which
more of him.
But I'm so, you know, it's incredible that she sort of stuck to her ground and made the film exactly the film that she wanted to make.
I think just on that point of the casting, I think it was such an incredible decision, because as a mixed Black person, I definitely was like, well, it's obvious to me, obviously, that they're Black. So, you know, what do other people see? It began to make me question that, especially because, you know, we've had so many conversations on the 100%. Podcast where people are referred to as passing, and we can't fathom it. To be frank. So
hold on a minute.
Bizarre. Yeah, it just seems bizarre that's like it's become everyone's passing or something. It seems odd.
It's interesting because in the film, when Jack, my husband, played by Alexander, first meets Rini, you know, they kind of, I'm not very good at the technical stuff, Tessa, you're much better. They kind of bleach out the color, the frame. So everything's really kind of assaultingly white. Yeah. Also, I think that's to reinforce this idea that when someone holds power, right, or they think they do, they kind of assume, they have the luxury of assumption. Yes. And for him, I think he's assuming, like, why would there be a Black person in this room? Why would there be a Black person in this hotel?
Exactly.
That happens so much. I know it happens.
Yes.
Environment is key. Is that so many people, they can't see your color because they don't expect you to be in their milieu. They don't expect you to be in their orbit. And that to me is bonkers. That's what being in the status quo and having that power for so long does. It just you become sort of ignorant and less observant. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But as people of color, you know, and Du Bois talks about it as well, of double consciousness, you know, we are always observing. Yes. We're always observing rooms, situations, you know, and it goes back to what you're saying and why I am not safe resonated with both me and Tessa and the audience. Where are we safe?
Yes.
You know, what spaces are we safe in? Because for someone who's safe, they don't need to have that double consciousness, you know, so they miss, in many ways, they miss the subtleties. Whereas we have no choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think you're entirely, it's so true and so right, Ruth, this assumption, if you have power, you have the power of assumption. And also that the sort of perverse thing about the insidiousness of racism is there's this idea that if the person is brilliant, charming, smart, they couldn't be Black. They wouldn't be Black. Exactly. It also allows people to pass. Like there was that woman, Velda Costa Green, who built up the JP Morgan library, and she passed. And you look at her and she's unmistakably a woman of color, right? But because she was so brilliant, so industrious, so witty, so smart, could be the life of the party, very much in the way that Claire could be this sort of born socialite because of her wit and her charm. People would go like, there's something happening here, but let's call it Italian, or let's call it something else, because what I know about Blackness is Blackness couldn't possibly be any of these things that I see in front of me presented in you. And so I think that's also something that that is really a part of the conversation of passing, is this like this that you're helped by these really grotesque assumptions about Black identity.
The irony.
Yeah, right. I think it was you, Ruth, and Rebecca who described Claire as destabilising in another interview or something I read, and we came up with that word in terms of the atmosphere of the film when we'd watched it. But then I was thinking about how the whole notion of passing, in a way, is destabilizing, obviously, to the hierarchy built by white supremacy and the idea that you can't hold dual identities at one time. So I wondered what you think about, you know, the idea of going further to that, and what you think about the concept of mixed people being destabilizing for society in general, or perhaps any identity that we can't immediately recognize or pigeonhole.
Yeah. I mean, people are uncomfortable with not having labels for you. We have this sort of absurd need to look at someone and go, this, and this, because it makes us feel safe.
Right.
Because if we label something, we have history with it and we understand it. But if you can't label someone, then it really, I don't know, I always feel people become sort of suspicious.
Yeah,
very stressed.
And I'm not sure if it's the right word, but it feels like the right word, because it's kind of, and when you're met with that constantly, as I have been through my life, I mean, it has to have an effect on your psyche. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And you just know. And sometimes it's like, I feel like Nella sometimes I'm just sort of like playing around with how she must have felt. But sometimes it's very isolating and you feel targeted.
Yeah.
Sometimes you feel sort of, there's a real sort of grim power there, and you think, wow, little old me is making situation so much that I'm making you uncomfortable. I have that power. Wow, that's amazing. So it's pretty layered, but I mean, we've got this perverse obsession with labels and boxes. And I do kind of understand that, in terms we have to label things, good, bad, but in terms of people, it doesn't make sense, does it?
Yes. Yeah.
But yet it does make sense if you're the status quo, because once you put people in the boxes and separate them, they're easier to sort of control, and it's easier to sort of pitch people against one another, I mean, that's another thing that Nella explores and touches on is class,
Yes.
So brilliantly with Zulina, the maid, and how uncomfortable Irene is around.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yet
so uncomfortable.
Claire just waltzes in and makes friends with her, and and it kind of doesn't make sense. That's destabilizing.
Yeah.
Because it sort of turns our assumptions of what should be upside down. But that's why I think things that are uncomfortable have always I found a home there, because I've been dealing with that my entire life. It's not foreign to me.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I think that was the perfect place for us to end on. Thank you, ladies, so much. It's been an absolute privilege and pleasure. Yeah, such a joy.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode.
And don't forget, you can still join our Patreon community over at patreon.com/mixeduppodcast. We look forward to seeing you there. Bye.